Welcome, everyone. We are really fortunate today to have a couple of old acquaintances of ours presenting. Um, they presented on this project at the Digital Humanities Conference in Washington, D.C. This last August. And I was so impressed, right? I kind of knew about what was going on with the project, but seeing what they've done, I learned so much. And I am absolutely delighted that they are willing to come join us and share that with us. So, who is speaking today? Victoria Van Heining is Assistant Professor of Library Innovation at the College of Information, University of Maryland, College Park. Her background is in medieval and early modern English literature, digital humanities, citizen science, and cultural heritage crowdsourcing. And she publishes quite a bit in those areas. She's co-founder and director of the Center for Archival Futures, where she focuses on community cultural heritage, crowdsourcing, and data reuse. So Baron Jordan is Assistant Research Engineer at the College of Information at University of Maryland. His background is in biomedical engineering, and he's been working in the field of accessibility for over 20 years. So he's principal investigator and director of the Trace Rehabilitation Engineering Research Center on Universal Access to ICT, and is a member of the Maryland Initiative for Digital Accessibility. So without further ado,
we're going to turn it over to Baron and
Victoria.
Thank you, Ben and Sarah. This is Victoria, and today Baron and I are going to be talking about creating accessible transcriptions to increase discovery and use of crowdsourced outputs by blind and low vision users. And in case anybody's wondering, we did wonder if the title could be shorter, and we weren't able to think of something snappier. So there we are. And I think later in this talk, or towards the end, we'll drop in a few links to the project we're going to talk about today, our GitHub repository where you can find an accessible version of the slides that we're talking through today, and other slides we've given at other venues, and information about publications that we're getting out there. And the project email is also in the slide deck if you want to reach out to us as a team. And I don't know, Baron, did you want to add anything before I get into the next few slides?
Just so you know my voice, this is Baron Jordan. And yep, I'm an engineer at heart and by training. And so I like to find problems and fix them.
And has been a very willing collaborator in the digital humanities cultural heritage side. Very game. So thank you, Baron, for all the work you did on this grant and do on this grant. So today we're going to trot through some key definitions that are relevant to the talk today, but also to the wider body of work that we're presenting part of. We'll talk through the research questions for the grant in question and our methods and goals. We'll talk you through some screen reader user personas, because like any group, this is not a monolithic group of people who use ICT all in the same way. And we learned a lot of interesting things during the process of this study and other studies that Baron's taken part in through various collaborators of ours. We're going to be focusing on a case study from the Dartmouth libraries, Dartmouth being a partner, a LAM partner on this grant effort. We're going to look at some Ada Blackjack code and encodings of transcriptions made by crowdsourcing volunteers, some changes that we tested, some findings, and then from that, some recommendations, and we'll briefly touch on future work and get into the Q&A. I think Ben and Sarah were saying that typically Q&A happens in the chat, so if you've got anything that you want to ask us, they'll voice those questions towards the end. But if there's like an emergency, you don't understand something while we're going through, please drop that in the chat, and Ben and Sarah, you can interrupt us if the clarity would really help somebody understand what's going on while we're giving the talk. In addition to Baron and myself, we have a graduate assistant Mace Jones, doctoral candidate here at the University of Maryland and the College of Information. And Mace has been integral to the full life cycle of this project, from the grant writing with me back in 2021 through to all of the interviews and other research that we've been doing. That's the data that we're going to be sharing today. So crowdsourced data, accuracy, accessibility, and authority, or CDAAA, is a 3-year Institute of Museum and Library Services early career grant project to identify the socio-technical barriers that libraries, archives, and museums face in making crowdsourced transcriptions accessible to sighted users and print-disabled people who use assistive technology to access digital text. There's a QR code here, which will link to that GitHub repository, and I think Ben and Sarah may be dropping that link into the chat as well. So some key definitions today. When we say accessible, we mean that people with disabilities have equal or comparable access and use of information and data compared to those without a recognized disability. But we recognize that accessible also in the cultural heritage and DH realms often means that sighted folks can find materials, and a lot of times transcription, as many of you know, is undertaken for both purposes. So to make images of primary documents discoverable down to the page level or the document level for people who are conducting a search visually, using search bars and all sorts of other, library information search methods. But also a lot of our partners and a lot of other folks in this domain are specifically calling on volunteers or friends of the library or whomever to make transcriptions so that they're accessible to people who have low vision or who are blind. And this is really the heart of what we're investigating today, or through this grant talking about today. When we talk about assistive technology, broadly, that means products, equipment, systems, including software that enhance learning, working, and daily living for persons with disabilities. Today, we'll primarily talk about screen readers, NVDA, and JAWS were the ones that our participants typically used, and Braille readers, where people can go and, to quote one of our participants, read by hand a transcription or some other, a web element or book or something like that. A print disability is a difficulty or inability to read printed or digital material due to a perceptual, physical, or visual disability. Semantic HTML has meaning or purpose. Semantics derived from HTML tags used, and this will come up in more detail later. And it is a way of encoding text and all sorts of other things in a digital form. The TEI guidelines, or the Text Encoding Initiative, is another way of going about marking up text, and lots of you here will be familiar with and will be applying TEI already. It's a semantic XML developed by Digital Humanities, GLAM, and other scholars and practitioners, with over 500 tags for textual components and concepts. And I think it's been under development since the 1980s, but correct me if I'm wrong. And Baron, over to you.
Yeah, so there are a number of different guidelines that exist out there for accessibility, but probably the most well-known and the most cited and used in other regulations around the world are the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, or WCAG. The current version is 2.2, but versions 2.1 and 2.0 are also still in effect. And so different regulations might reference different versions of it, and they're all still valid. They are generally backwards compatible. So if you meet 2.2, you also meet 2.1 and 2.0 for the most part. So it covers a wide range of disabilities, including visual, auditory, physical, speech, cognitive, language, learning, and neurological disabilities. And it is used widely around the world. So to give a really brief overview of WCAG, web content should be POUR is our acronym: perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. Perceivable information is something that users can perceive, and this is important for everybody. operable, that the user interface components and navigation needs to be operable by people with disabilities and everybody, that all the information that you're getting from the system, including feedback and from the operation of the device, that all of that must be understandable. And applying more to people who use assistive technologies is the robust category. That content must be robust enough that it can be interpreted or translated by a wide variety of user agents. And so screen readers are an example of a system that needs to have robust access to the underlying content. And just as a fun fact, the original draft that went into WCAG 1.0, which is now obsolete, came from the Trace Center, where I am, back in 1998, and it was the Unified Web Accessibility Guidelines. And Trace moved to the University of Maryland in 2016, and we continue our work there. Next slide, please.
Okay, so CDAAA research questions, we are pursuing 3, and they match up with the different A's in the title of the grant. So research question 1 focuses on authority. Are LAMs able to integrate crowdsourced transcriptions into their CMSs or someplace in their authoritative record? If yes, how? And if not, what sociotechnical barriers do they face? Research question 2 touches on authority and accuracy. What are LAM practitioners' attitudes towards crowdsourced transcription data quality? Do these attitudes impact whether or not crowdsourced data are incorporated into CMSs and other places? And how do LAM practitioners assess the quality of crowdsourced data? And research question 3, which is what we'll focus on today, is on accessibility. When transcription data is successfully integrated into a content management system or database, is it accessible to people who are print disabled? And for what we wound up focusing on this, in this grant and the testers, which you'll hear much more about and from later on, are people who are blind and have low vision. Though in the original grant, we actually were thinking about folks who might be dyslexic or have chronic migraine or epilepsy, other things that might limit their screen use and who may or may not use assistive technology to access crowdsourced transcriptions and the documents underlying them. If content is not accessible, again, more narrowly in this case for people who are blind or have low vision, what's required to make the data legible? And what are print disabled users' experiences of searching for and reading transcription data? So for our research methods, we have a sort of a flow chart here of how we've been approaching the different components of the grant work. So in the first year, Mace and I conducted semi-structured interviews with our LAM partners, and we're kind of trying to dig into those questions around the accuracy and authority piece primarily. And then for those partners who had successfully integrated crowdsourced data content into their content management system or something like Dataverse or Zenodo or whatever else, we then did an ingest, a demonstration session where we watched them, do that process of how do they get their transcriptions out of, for example, from the page or Zooniverse or some other place and into whatever the end CMS or databases or repository is. So 9 out of our 12 partners had integrated their data, and 3 have not integrated the data. 2 are very unlikely to be able to do so. There were issues with I think we'll say the complexity of the data that they got out of their projects, and trying to kind of navigate how to deal with that, and also some issues about maybe where the data will fit into their content management system. And then 1 partner was in the process of a data migration, and the new system will hopefully hold the data, but it's sort of a TBD. So this grant and the findings actually might be helpful in that decision. We had then recruited 12 folks who who are either blind or have low vision to test our LAM partner systems where there was successful ingest. And that's what we'll be talking about primarily today. And the results of this are talks like this. We're going to be publishing, we have a couple of publications already. We're creating user personas and stories and reports for each of our partners. So we'll have some pull quotes from the participants and specific advice from our own sessions with the disabled users, but also with our partners, and kind of a white paper looking across all of the different systems and user experiences. And those will all be made available through the GitHub link that we've shared earlier, and whatever relevant publications, obviously. And then I think this might be my last before I turn over to Baron for a little while. So the goals of the project are to work with our LAM partners and our accessibility testers to better understand the impact that transcription data management and editing choices or markup choices have on the experience of people who rely on assistive technology to interact with digitized primary sources, like manuscript images, letters, diaries, etc., and the associated transcriptions. And over to you, Baron.
Thanks. So screen readers, some of you may not be familiar with them. They're assistive technology. It's software that's installed on computers and mobile devices that essentially read off the text on the screen. They don't just read the text, literally they add other information that kind of comes from metadata and other data. So they are a translation of visual screen content. And this gets translated to speech, but it can also be translated to Braille devices. So people run a screen reader and may use this just a speech output, or they may also send the output to a Braille device with dynamic Braille and read it by hand, as some people say. Now, websites tend to be designed visual first. They're visual first interfaces. And so this has some implications for screen reader users. And the first is that they experience a layered interface. So they're interacting with an audio interface, which is a translation of a visual interface. And that translation isn't always perfect. They must explore carefully. With this visual layout, you can get a lot of information just by kind of a visual overview of it. And a screen reader doesn't give a visual overview. You have to listen through the content. So there are different ways of navigating to explore. But some people have called it, including some of our participants have called it a soda straw effect. That it is using a screen reader can be like reading visually with the soda straw, where you're looking at one word at a time. And that's what they have to attend to when they're using a screen reader. This means that it can be easy to miss visually obvious info. Some help for this could be, better encoding and other information, but it does mean that there are things that might be visually very obvious, but are somewhere deep in the page, or it's a new visual obvious information, and they've already passed it, and they don't know that some change was made earlier. And so these are some things that can happen to screen reader users. Next slide, please. So we recently presented a paper at the Assets Conference on accessibility, and we wrote up a paper on 5 personas of screen reader users, because it's an experience to work with people who use screen readers, and sometimes you can be surprised. There's such a wide variety of behavior and preferences of people and how they use their system, how they have their system set up, what kind of level of speech they have coming out of their systems. People have different levels of prior experiences. They might spend lots of times on library sites because they do research, and so they are more used to information searching. They may use other kinds of applications online, and so there are different levels of experience that people have. And with that, there's also different levels of skills and troubleshooting strategies. So skills in the screen reader itself. There's some people who readily switch between modes and try different ways of getting to things. And then there are some other people who have very strongly preferred modes, and they will use that primarily as their main way of navigating through the documents and finding things. So if you're interested in these personas, you can follow the DOI or the QR code that's on the screen. Next slide.
Okay, so I'm going to talk us through, again, just the methods for this particular part of the study, answering our third research question. So this is an accessibility and usability study paradigm. We had set task prompts and then observed users as they first just tried to locate the given LAM partner's site where the content would hopefully be discoverable to them, to then do a general search for transcriptions of any kind. And we were flexible in trying to offer, different hints on potential search strategies there. Most of our participants were wholly new to all of the sites that they tested. But an important characteristic of the group we recruited from with the help of the National Federation of the Blind, which is located in Baltimore, is that the participants were all hailing from an academic mailing list. So there were some undergraduate, master's, doctoral students, people who had attained multiple degrees, people who work in cultural heritage themselves. So it was a really broad sweep within that focus area of academic type users. And so we thought these were folks, and the NFB thought that these would be good folks who would kind of have some underlying familiarity with these kinds of systems, library systems, potentially archival and museum systems, and have an interest in primary documents potentially for their work. And we did indeed find that to be the case in some instances, and some of our testers hadn't really pursued using primary sources in their work yet. 11 participants are blind, one has low vision, and used a magnifier instead of a screen reader. Everybody participated remotely, and they used their own assistive technology setup, so there were no hiccups to do with sort of unfamiliarity with a setup that we provided, for example. And each participant tried 3 systems in a random counterbalanced assignment, so nobody tested the same system in the same order. And each system was tested by 4 different people. And at the end of that, and this is what we're going to focus on more deeply, is 11 of the participants tried a 1-page accessible excerpt of the Ada Blackjack diary. And in, I believe, 2 cases, or 3 cases, those folks had also tested the Dartmouth library system. So sometimes there are comparisons direct comparisons in their experience and reflections. And I will actually hand over to Baron here. I made a last minute change to the slides, but then I'll add a little note. So sorry, Baron, go ahead.
So the image shown on the screen is a diary page from the Ada Blackjack diary. She's Inupiat. She was the sole survivor of the Wrangel Island expedition. And so this diary, the images and the transcriptions are available at the Dartmouth website. And so the diary page here is relatively light. It's kind of somewhat yellowed paper, and it has light, looks like pencil handwriting on it.
And the reason I made a change to this slide kind of late at the 11th hour, and I see little infelicities in my typing, but I just wanted to say, going back and looking at the Dartmouth Library's description of this document and the collection in which it sits, it was some really thoughtful example of acknowledging the different indigenous and settler knowledge systems that combine to create a document like this particular experience of Ada Blackjack that will be the pages that we'll be looking at later, where she talks about hunting foxes in order to survive, and chopping wood and doing all these things are all things that she learned or figured out how to do when all the other members of the expedition had either died or were not doing very well. And she survived, by learning these skills, some say, relying on a sort of innate indigenous knowledge. And I thought that the library folks had described that really well. So I wanted to point you to that, and I'll drop the link into the chat for further information. And back over to you, Baron.
Yeah, so if you look a little bit closer at it, if you look at the document, the image of itself, I've highlighted two portions of it. The first is text where she corrected her spelling of the word funny. She had put a Y in a little bit early, crossed it out, and then entered in the typical spelling for it. And then the second correction that was made was the word 5 is crossed out and 6. So this is in the phrase, I saw 6 cut of wood and I chop only 3. And so visually in the Dartmouth system, you can see that in the middle that there is the deletions are marked out with kind of a dotted border and kind of yellow slashes through the letters of the word that's deleted. And the inserted text is denoted by kind of a superscript version of the text and flanked by 2 caret symbols. And so that's what it looks like visually. But for screen reader users, there were kind of a couple problems that we found right away. One was that with some screen reader settings, that words at line boundaries fused for some readers. So you might have the end of the first into the second line, we have trap in. The next line would be trap by. Next one would be one cut. And so this was read rather strangely and took a little bit of figuring for the people that this affected. It wasn't universal. It didn't happen for everybody, but it was some screen readers in some settings did that. And the other problem that we knew right away that we need to address was that these add and deleted indications are visual only in the markup. And so they are marked with TEI, but they are visual only, and so there would be no good way for a screen reader to be able to access that information. Next slide, please. So you don't need to read all the code here, but this is the HTML here. Some things that I wanted to point out just for this one page of the diary is that headers are marked. Here they're all marked with H2 tags. At the end of every line, there's a span that has a class of line break. This span is empty. It has no content. Then we have deletions. They are enclosed in a span, which has the class of TEI underscore DEL. And insertions have kind of a couple marks. They have a span that contains the carets. This, again, flanks the inserted text. And then the inserted text itself is enclosed in a span with the class TEI underscore added underscore text. And so this is kind of the information that's in the version that's available on the Dartmouth website. So go ahead and move to the next screen. So we made a more accessible version for testing because we wanted to get people's feedback on what might it be like if we used more semantic HTML. And so we kept the headers because people really like being able to navigate by header. That most people, I think, were frequently using the H key, which is a shortcut for stepping through the headers in a document. And that's one way that people navigate quickly and find things. We replaced the CSS line break spans with semantic line breaks, the BR tag. And this did prevent the problem where the lines were read or strung together. The span for deleted text, we actually used a DEL tag. It's maybe not used that often in HTML, but it is a semantic tag that's available. And similarly for added text, we replaced those spans with INS or insert tags. We did not add back in the TEI classes simply because we had no cascading style sheets or other things in this particular version for the people to use. We just wanted to use kind of the raw display that the system would provide, and then the screen reader would also provide its own information about it. Next slide, please. So you can see the resulting code is definitely a little bit shorter. So a lot of that's because we removed these spans with the TEI information. TEI information can certainly be added back into these documents, but you can see the markup changes. Next slide, please. So participants just had varied responses to the current version that's available on the Dartmouth site. People did like being able to navigate or jump by headings, and that was something that was mentioned, I think, by most, if not all, of the users who tried that. There was some confusion about one of the conventions that the system used, that the folio or the page numbers wasn't given. Instead, it was given as a header unpaginated. And so most of them were unsure what unpaginated meant, that it was, going to another page. Some of them, were able to figure that out. But others it was unclear to them what unpaginated meant. And then, as I mentioned before, line breaks were read incorrectly for some participants. And so ACC4 said some words are run together and some aren't. There doesn't seem to be a consistent pattern inside of the text. Next slide, please.
So the responses to the modified textual markup that Baron was just talking us through, 9 out of 10 screen reader users commented on deleted and inserted text. Again, still trying to some extent make sense of what that was and what its purpose was. There was one instance where one person's screen reader did not announce any markup at all, so just sort of read the text as it was there, and that's to do with their settings. Many users read through edits character by character, as well as listening to the document sort of read aloud, kind of as you would expect, trying to make sense again of those deletions and insertions. At this point, and we also saw this with folks who were testing documents from the Folger, who's a named partner on the grant as well. They would switch to a Braille display to read by hand, trying to understand tags, trying to understand special characters, for example, in early modern Spanish that came up in another test. And there was an instance where people found that they were being signaled to the start of a delete tag, but not the end by their screen reader. And they thought, well, that might be my screen reader setup. They weren't totally sure. 3 users mentioned track changes as a metaphor. And for some people, they were, saying, oh, that's kind of interesting. It's signaling to me that there's some changing going on here. But for a number of folks, it was an irritation. It was like, well, I just want to have a kind of a clean reading experience. And so they were commenting on that negatively. And that was it at multiple points in the testing, including in this semantic HTML markup we were testing. A number of people thought that the edits might have been made by the transcribers. So where Ada Blackjack is crossing words out or part of a word out, they weren't sure if that was her and her original spelling or her original marking, or if that was something happening later. And 2 people hypothesized that the markings were in fact in the original manuscript, but they were never totally certain of those things.
Yeah, so one of the recommendations that we have is to use accessible markup. So the inclusion of headings is very much appreciated, especially in longer texts. So where it's short, it might not be so necessary. But with longer text, we had ACC 12 say, having them as headings makes it really easy to jump to. Also, using semantic HTML markup where possible. So ACC 9 said, having marks this way is more helpful than the original format that was presented. We are happy to say that FromThePage has already adopted this recommendation, and so there was a quick change after the DH presentation in August to FromThePage and getting that into the system. We do recognize that HTML doesn't have all of the semantic complexity that TEI does. Assistive technologies, however, are very much geared towards working with HTML. And to my knowledge, there's no assistive technology that reads TEI tags and gives that information to screen reader users or to any other assistive technology users. In a way that's kind of to be expected in that TEI is a specialized format, and many people will read it or encounter it in the XML form if they need to see all the details of TEI, and then they might see an extract of that when they're sort of viewing it, and that extract might very well be HTML, for example. Next slide.
So essentially what we're arguing for is perhaps an accessible, regularized or normalized version of a text. So some institutions, I mentioned the Folger earlier, are trying to experiment with, okay, well, we have a diplomatic and a semi-diplomatic transcription of an early modern receipt book. So could we, use AI or some other method? And I think Ben, and indeed if we have Folger colleagues here today who want to jump in and say anything about this in the Q&A, there are experiments with making kind of modern language, as it were, versions of text which would be appreciated by many users, not just users who maybe can't see the original text. But that there could be, in creation of a normalized version, really gearing that towards or optimizing that for an accessible version. And we just saw users again and again interested in a fluent reading of the content. So our first tester said, I would just think this is a mistake related to the transcription. I wouldn't think surely this is what originally existed in the document. Maybe we should find another label for that. And that quote, I think, kind of captures some of the complexity of the response. People weren't saying like, we just want something simple and like to move on. They were interested in the complexity, but they wanted a bit more insight into kind of what the function and the purpose of the complexity they were being presented with was for.
And so that really does lead into our next recommendation about conventions and providing these markup and transcription conventions for the readers in general. So offer it potentially before the transcriptions, make this potentially a link in the record at the top of a download. Surfacing these for people can really help them understand ahead of time what kinds of things they're going to encounter when they're reading the document. So ACC 6 said, if you want to be faithful to the text, that should be indicated, and that's important. But without an explanation, the original marked up text didn't make sense. So by giving them conventions ahead of time, they would be able to have better sense of what the document is that they're encountering and what the various markup, either digital markup or text, in-text kinds of markup, like something's illegible or other things like that. And so this would be important for people, especially who cannot see the document and need to get kind of extra information about the conventions that are being used. Next slide.
So descriptions is another thing that we were investigating, and this is really key to Mesa's research. So including material descriptions for digitized objects, such as like contextualizing notes to help people understand maybe genre or material aspects of the original. So sometimes the markup was leading people to think that the Blackjack Diary was a poem, or that a recipe or receipt from the Folger was a poem because of the short lines. And this information actually is often baked into metadata, and if people wanted to explore around, they might be able to find it in that way. But a brief explanation might be useful, kind of, baked into some other explanation of like the transcription conventions, for example. ACC 11 said it's good to have that piece of information. It adds some kind of a human touch. He was specifically talking about physical features of the document he was looking at. And I would honestly like to have access to that information because sighted people can have access to that information. So there's this call for parity there. And we saw that elsewhere too. Over to you, Baron.
Yeah, so we're going to discuss kind of a longer reflection to end out our session. This user gave us a lot of insight, not only into the blackjack material, but good accessibility practices more broadly, navigation strategies, and just kind of brought home the real possibility that we can lose users when they can't find accessible versions of text. So I'll go ahead and read this first section from ACC 3. But I guess it's just like anything. It's nice to have the structure. Search results with headings, and it's nice if somebody has labeled all the graphics with correct alt texts rather than just whatever random string of numbers for the file name. But the metadata on those systems was all pretty good. Like once you got in there, if there was a transcript, it would tell you in what format you could download. I think the other one is just like when you select something, then the focus needs to, if something has popped up as a result of your button push or whatever, your focus needs to go there because otherwise it's just a mission to find it. That's a common issue. You have to look for it. So we've highlighted a few strings in here that it's talking, ACC 3 talked about the structure of the document and having correct alternative text for images and managing the focus properly. These are all aspects of the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. Next slide.
And ACC 3 continues on to say, I guess one tricky thing to know is, why is the text looking difficult to read for me as a screen reader user? Does it look visually difficult to read as well? Because I got the impression from what you were saying about the early modern Spanish that it looked a little bit better than what I was seeing, or it was a little more obvious what it should say visually than what I was reading. Because, yeah, that is, I guess, a tricky thing when you're talking about lots of different scripts and older scripts. And I remember downloading some Shakespearean ones in this person's undergraduate studies. So 1600s, I guess, that would have had the V's and the U's the other way around with the printers back then, and being like, okay, I'm not using that text, I'll go find another version. And of course, with our transcriptions of primary documents, these are often unique. Many of them have never been, published in an edition. And so there isn't another version of the text. And, this person's frustration with these were, sort of classroom printed editions, for an English literature course, where, many of us, myself included, prize being able to use text in the original language. But this really brought home for me as an early modernist the value of a modernized version in a new light. Hadn't thought about it in that way before. So to wrap up, our future work, just briefly, is we're going to clean transcriptions gathered from our LAM partner interviews and demonstration sessions. We're mostly done with all the cleanup for the accessibility user testing sessions, and we really focused that while we had Baron's time on the grant this year. Our white paper, partner reports, and other publications and communications are underway, and the projected end date is September of 2026. And we have some grant funder thank yous and other thank yous here and contact information, and now we'll open it up for questions. Thank you all for being here.
We'll give people a little bit of time to type a question into the chat, but there was some discussion at the very beginning about terminology. I was wondering if one of you could kind of address this. So
because it's obvious that you've thought a lot about terms like print disabled, visually impaired, blind, low vision. Yeah.
Yeah, I was seeing that like out of the corner of my eye while we were presenting and wanting to address, and Baron, of course, please do as well. So, I mean, I think there are a number of terms that work well and that are accurate. I think because we wound up specifically recruiting people who are blind predominantly and one low vision person, we wanted to be clear that we were sort of which experiences we were talking about, because the experience of using a magnifier versus a screen reader are pretty different. And the search strategies that we observed, again, within our blind user population, those were quite heterogeneous and then quite different again from that of our magnifier user. Ben, do you want to add anything on terminology?
Yeah, also with terminology, I think that so there's some mention of like using visually impaired users and blind and low vision users and print disabled. There are a lot of terms in that are out there. Some disability groups have selected terms that they like to use themselves, and so, but that's not universal necessarily. And so, a lot of times, in kind of the accessibility research, we'll shorthand things to blind and low vision users. Um, Whereas other disabilities, we might actually state the disability after. So some are identity first, blind user, and a user who is blind would be kind of person first language. The National Federation of the Blind had at one of their conventions, they one of their um, positions was to use identity first language for their community. Not all communities have that, so there is kind of a mix, and sometimes actually scholars will mix it up a little bit just because they recognize that different groups and others might use different types of language. Print disability does have a specific term in the library field, especially with the libraries for the print disabled. They used to be libraries for the blind and physically handicapped, but those were thankfully renamed now. And so every state has at least one library where people who are print disabled, this might be because of blindness, it might also be because of a physical disability that makes it impossible to effectively turn pages and keep a book open. And so they are allowed to have access to special digital talking books, digital talking book players, digital talking book apps, and Braille books that are available to those patrons.
Cool. We're going to ask a question that came up in the chat, but as we're doing that, which is probably a barren question, but could we go back to the slide that had the user personas on screen readers? Because I did not manage to get the QR code. Like, I don't know, we need to link to that to drop into the chat because it sounded really fascinating. But we weren't acting fast enough to get the QR code up to drop it into the chat. So Ben's going to do that now for anyone who wants it. Okay, and while we're doing that, I'm going to read the question from Joshua Shaw. He says, I'm one of the devs from Dartmouth, and this will definitely help us become more accessible. One question for now. The documents can present changes by the original creator and guesses and other notations by the transcribers. This is really interesting, right? True. What would be the best way to indicate these different types of insertions, deletions, etc. in the HTML?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, there is not the richness that that TEI has. HTML has semantics, and those semantics are generally well supported by assistive technology, but TEI goes way beyond what HTML has available. So you are left with a translation problem where, the target HTML just doesn't have the richness that the original source TEI had. So some of this, I think that's where maybe talking about the conventions can really become an important part of this. That where you have a document that has guesses and notations by transcribers, you might say, this is how we've notated them. We've just included it in plain text in the document. You can search for this information. If there are other information, you might do that. So I think that there isn't really a best practice, I think, around that. And it'd be really fun to, I think, explore that with people who have specific examples. So, Joshua, that might be a great thing for us to maybe have a conversation about a little bit later, what might be the best practices, and maybe we can get a couple of blind users to, answer some questions for us.
Include us in that if you
Okay.
don't.
Yeah, it's a party.
Ideally,
Focus group.
provide really great exports from the page that don't need a ton of post-processing to get to an accessible version. We're not 100% there yet. Right.
Yeah, I think this is also where like the transcription conventions come in, because sometimes our users, we say, please just like put things in square brackets and a question mark, or like 5 question marks in a row. And I think, having worked on By the People and Zooniverse projects and From the Page projects, like we come to different sort of conventions every time. So that's a whole, kettle of fish. I think that's where kind of providing users with that information so that they can extrapolate from that. And that is a cognitive lift, but what I think we saw so consistently and see with our various blind colleagues and collaborators, some of whom we wrote the screen reader users paper with, is that people do an extraordinary amount of bushwhacking to find and make sense of stuff. And like we had people troubleshooting in some of the testing we did where they would like download something and then they would run it through OCR and they would like try to, fiddle around with it to make it kind of comprehensible. And they had really often great like instincts guessing kind of why things were the way they were. But again, those like divisions between the transcriber's interpolation or guess and the thing in the original, like I don't think we've really touched on that deeply in our own testing. So that would be fun to work on next. So please reach out to our email and maybe we'll be able to set something up in the next few months.
So we've got another question. Helen Baer, and I'm going to join her in this, would love to hear a description of the personas. I would too.
And do they match these pictures?
Yeah.
They don't look so cool, right?
So, I mean, I could talk a little bit about each of them. I don't want to take up a whole time because that was a 15-minute presentation in itself. But I can read maybe from the top to bottom, like a really short synopsis. Shannon was the first one. She's the adventurer. She's an early adopter. She's an expert in all the tools that she uses, and she uses a wide variety of strategies for navigating and problem solving. We have Stuart the Ranger, who's the second one, kind of wearing the hood. He relies on rich prior experience. He uses both speech and braille in his interactions. And he needs to work around some minor barriers associated with age, such as he's losing some fingertip sensitivity and it's making it a little slower to read braille than it used to be. We have Mira the Wanderer. She's the third one here, who's got a smartphone up to her face, and she's a smartphone first user. So she prefers using smartphone screen readers and mobile kinds of paradigms. She tends to also navigate more linearly and thoroughly than others, so she doesn't use quite as many techniques as some of the others have. We have Jose as the sightseer. He searches and reads the web in 2 languages. He also sometimes has to work in familiar apps to work around the inaccessibility of other apps. So sometimes he does his work in Word and then pastes it into a different system, and really hopes that the paste system actually works, which it doesn't always work for him in some systems. And then we have Jamie, who's the bard, kind of wearing a fancy medieval looking outfit and playing what looks like a lute. He does not use screen readers at all. And this is one that we sort of realized as we were writing these personas that we forgot the 5th one. These are people who aren't actually screen reader users today, but might like to use them in the future. So they make phone call. Jamie makes phone calls and uses a smart speaker currently. And hopefully screen readers, he'll be able to find a simpler screen reader to be able to access things. But right now it's just not worth the effort to do that. And so those are our 5 personas, and the paper is open access. So.
And we did drop that in, so.
And we were talking about another potential persona yesterday, just Baron and I, which is maybe somebody who doesn't update their technologies because they don't feel like they have the time or comfort, or some of these are free, but some of them are quite expensive. So some people are sticking with older versions of their assistive tech and therefore can't use, sometimes like, certain technologies or certain web
HTML5.
architectures. Yeah. So yeah, thinking, simplicity there and structure and document types and file types might be a real boon to those folks.
Wow. We've got about 3 minutes left. Are there any other questions? And at this point, feel free to unmute yourself and yell something out.
So, I'm thinking out loud here, but if anyone else can interrupt me for questions. But I think about what it would take to get to a better support for these types of accessible versions from the page. I actually see two pieces. One is developing some standard transcription conventions. We have standard transcription conventions. They're pretty minimal because we want everyone to be able to kind of modify them for their own purpose. But I do think a good example of here's transcription conventions that help you get to accessible versions is one piece of it. And then I think the other piece of it, especially if you compare it with known transcription conventions, is what's the export? When we do an HTML export or a TEI export, what tags are we using, and can we make those consistent, and can we document them? And then I can't quite visualize how to do this just yet, but your point that we needed to add the transcription conventions as a link or a reference at the top of every export, so that those could be incorporated, so people navigating those documents could also find the assumptions that were built into them. So I think it's super interesting. Yeah. And not that hard, right? It's not that hard to do. It's just, you have to think about it, and you have to have smart people tell you this is the things to do.
Yeah, I think one of the interesting pieces there is also like our transcription conventions change, right? So sometimes we start out and then we learn from our volunteers, like, oh, actually that's really time consuming, or I don't think that makes sense, and adapt. And so kind of having like layers of those matching the appropriate moment in time, the conventions with the transcriptions can also be a little bit of a extra piece to think about. But yeah, we learned so much from our users. It was our testers really a fruitful experience, and I think there were just some very clear, calls for things that are in reach. We'd love to see get taken up.
Yeah.
I love Janet's comment that I think is a good closing, which is that she often wondered what the purpose of some of our transcription notations really serve, and do they make the user experience worse? And I think that is an amazing way to close, because you've done that research, and it turns out sometimes it does make the user experience worse.
I think there are different goals, right? We are completionists. We want to capture everything that's represented in a handwritten text, but that is different from what makes that handwritten text accessible to somebody using a screen reader.
Yeah, and I know we're like right at time, but I will say too, again, like when I started at Zooniverse about 10 years ago now or more, we were trying to make transcriptions that would work for, machine learning, handwritten text recognition training, and kind of had a sense that like, oh, these could be accessible transcriptions and useful for scholars. And like, I think having to come to the understanding that like not all transcriptions will meet every need, but there might be some things that we can do in post-processing to simplify them or to complicate them, or make them serve different needs. But there isn't one final output that I think really is going to serve all of those needs. There can't be. And that's where providing the information about like, how did this specific thing get made and what was the intention there, could be fruitful. And Samara put in the chat, the idea of like toggling on and off, like there may be some interesting things to be done there as well, in our various content management systems.
So thank you all so much for coming. Ben's dropping a link to our next webinar at the end of February, and it's about how we re-engineered search, or in the middle of re-engineering search for From the Page. It'll be done by the end of February. We'd love to see you there. We really appreciate you showing up and asking questions and participating. And thank you so much to Victoria and Baron.